everybody. Welcome to our March Legislation Committee meeting. We're delighted today to have Kristin Nimmers with us as a speaker. I am, as she's with the California Black Power Network. She is somebody I work with closely, a very thoughtful and deeply committed leader in policy and advocacy and community engagement. And I'm delighted that she's here today. She serves as the policy and campaign manager for the California Black Power Network, where she helps drive efforts for systemic change. She's also a committee lead with the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth, where she helps lead policy advocacy and community engagement on reparations. Her past work includes the California Calls Black Census and Redistricting Hub, where she advanced progressive democracy reforms. She supported redistricting advocacy, and she worked to engage Black communities in the census. And she brings a really impressive combination of legal training, of policy expertise, and on-the-ground organizing experience to this very important work. She earned her JD from McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific and her bachelor's in political science and communication from Humboldt State University. And we're really honored to have her with us here today. So please join me in welcoming Kristin Nimmers.
Thank you so much, Dora. I'm excited to be in space with y'all. Excited that y'all are interested and want to learn more about reparations. That's exciting to know. We are really trying to build a multiracial coalition of support for reparations. And so I'm excited to talk to y'all about what has happened so far, what we're working on, and progress that's been made in California so far. So first, I was going to start off with some background on the California Black Power Network and our alliance. So on the next slide, the California Black Power Network is a coalition of 49 Black-led and Black-serving grassroots organizations throughout the state. We originally came together to build more capacity among Black organizations to do voter engagement. We engaged folks in the 2020 census as a state partner, focusing on hard-to-reach Black communities, so like those communities that are significantly impacted by being low income, being system impacted, immigrants, non-English speakers, things like that. And we did advocacy during the redistricting process to really support and make sure that our communities were able to stay together and have some political power to elect candidates of their choice. And ultimately transitioned from that census and redistricting work into the Black Power Network to continue our work together as a broader coalition and really focus on a broader range of issues that are impacting Black communities. And so we've continued since then doing voter engagement every year, as well as policy advocacy in the legislature and at the local level. And we have partners all over the state representing 10 different counties, which I listed here on the slide, but in the areas of LA, the Inland Empire, Orange County, San Diego, Central Valley, as well as the Bay in Sacramento. And when the California Reparations Task Force was convened in 2020, we were asked to be an anchor partner to support their community engagement and outreach through listening sessions throughout the state. And during that process, we engaged over 400 Black residents about the ways that slavery and subsequent, state-sanctioned violence and racial discrimination had impacted their lives, impacted generations, their lineage, and what they really wanted to see as repair for the community. We worked to do a public education campaign about the task force process and about reparations, and support community members in attending the public hearings that were held during that process, and providing testimony on their experiences and what they really hope to see come out of the task force process. And on the next slide, we built strong relationships during that process with some of the task force members. Many of them were already engaged in community work prior to their work on the task force. And so we ended up convening the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth in partnership with former task force members, Dr. Cheryl Grills, who is a professor and psychology expert, Lisa Holder, who is a lawyer and is also the executive director of Equal Justice Society, and Don Tamaki, who is a significant leader in the Japanese reparations movement and has been a part of that for a long time, and has then transitioned to supporting Black reparations as well. And so once this task force concluded, we also brought together some other Black organizations that had been involved in reparations work. So we also work with Black Equity Collective, which is an organization just focused on resourcing and building the capacity of Black organizations. Live Free, which is a faith-based network of organizations that focus on criminal justice reform. And then also Catalyst California, which is not a Black organization, but is, an ally that has worked with us on a lot of different research for the work that we're doing. And our alliance is really focused on bringing the task force recommendations to fruition through policy advocacy, public education, and community engagement. And so today I'll be walking through what came out of the task force process, what has happened since the conclusion of their work, and how, the League of Women Voters and community members can really get engaged in this fight and support this work of repair. So to start off with the task force, um, AB 3121 in 2020 was passed to, if we go to the next slide, in AB 3121 was enacted to establish a reparations task force, which was studying and developing reparations proposals for African Americans. And in acknowledgement of the significant long-term harms that have resulted from the institution of slavery, the task force was charged with studying both the impact of chattel slavery itself, but also the lingering negative effects on living African Americans, including descendants of people who were enslaved, but also just society broadly. And I'm not sure if we can go to the next slide or if we're having tech pieces. So that was about the bill. And then next slide as well. And I can also share this with folks if y'all are interested to just check back on these as well. But the task force was tasked with study, community engagement, and then coming up with recommendations. So in order to complete their study, they held a number of public open hearings where experts provided testimony and studies on California history, the impact of slavery and racist policies, and the connections between those harms and the current conditions of Black communities. So, how did we get this current wealth gap that we have? Why are these the current educational outcomes? How does that connect to segregation and Jim Crow laws, the lifespan of Black folks and health outcomes and more, and really drawing the connection between all of those things and slavery and subsequent racial discrimination that was, state sanctioned and allowed. And then the public also provided testimony at those hearings where folks were telling their own family history. Organizations and other experts talked about different issue areas and the work that folks have been doing to heal some of the harms that were uplifted by experts when talking about the disparities that Black communities face. And so ultimately, all of this work culminated into a 1,000-page report that had a summary of a number of listening sessions that anchor groups had, but then also a summary of a survey that was put forth by the UCLA Bunch Center and research that was conducted by the DOJ and then by the task force members themselves. And at the end of that 1,000-page report, there are over 300 recommendations for how California could begin to address those harms. Next slide. And so, in addition to expert testimony and community testimony, those recommendations were also formed using an international framework for reparations that was developed by the United Nations. So this framework has been the basis for reparations for human rights violations across the world, and was formed with historical context of the different repair efforts that have gone on in other countries after things like genocides, civil wars, slavery, and other human rights issues. And so on the left of the slide, there's a breakdown of what the United Nations framework is. And I'm going to go through what's on the right side in a second. But popular kind of conversation about reparations mostly centers cash compensation, which is in line with this promise of 40 acres and a mule, and repayment for unpaid forced labor. And this is an important and significant form of reparations, but it's not the only recognized form of reparations. And there are 5 principles within the United Nations framework that are intended to facilitate like more holistic repair. And so those forms are restitution, which is around, restoring liberty, enjoyment of human rights, restoring those communities to how they were before the harm occurred. There's also compensation, which I think a lot of folks would know, and that's economic compensation for, harm that was caused, for lost wages and opportunity. There's rehabilitation, which really focuses on medical and psychological care, and was a really big thing that was brought up in the community listening sessions that we held. A lot of folks really wanted access to healthcare, and particularly mental health care. Um, and then there's also a guarantee of non-repetition. And I think maybe one got cut off, but I'll talk about the other one too. There's guarantee of non-repetition, which is reviewing and reforming the laws that are contributing to or allowing harm to continue. And then there's also satisfaction, which is like apology, formal public acknowledgement of the harms that were caused. Um, and there are different examples of what these things might look like. That could be free college or loan forgiveness when we're talking about restitution. That could be cash payments when we're talking about compensation. It could be free therapy when we're talking about rehabilitation. And in terms of, ending harms, we have, unfortunately, California didn't pass it, but we have been trying to end involuntary servitude within the state because we still have slavery ongoing right now in our prisons through unpaid labor. And there are, and this kind of comes up in the media as like a source of division, but there are two schools of thought in the reparations landscape. One is rooted in like harm-based reparations for Black people, which connects repair and eligibility for repair to specific harm. It's basically saying like this action or harm or racist policy harmed you, and so you're eligible for the program or the restitution that's meant to repair that harm. Um, and this framework
Sorry, one second, Kristen. Somebody is not muted and speaking in the background. Can everybody mute themselves?
They did that already.
Whoever, can you mute them, Savannah? Okay. Sorry, Kristen, keep going.
No worries. Um, and so the first school of thought is like harm-based reparations, which is essentially saying, it includes compensation for descendants of people who were enslaved, but also acknowledges that repair is not complete through compensation alone. So, for example, this would mean that like slavery is a harm and people are being compensated for that, but also segregated schools, separate and unequal education was a harm, and there could be a remedy for that. That's like free tuition for Black students at public universities. And so those things align with this reparations, this international reparations framework, but then also acknowledge like the different harms that occurred in addition to slavery and beyond slavery. And then lineage-based reparations is really focused on who can trace their lineage to someone who was enslaved prior to 1865. So this framework is really focused on compensation for slavery as like the sole form of reparations. And it's focused on closing the wealth gap through direct cash payments to Black people who can prove lineage. And I think, folks might see this as division, especially in how that's like framed as far as like the narrative around Black communities in the public. But really, I think our perspective is just kind of yes and like descendants of slaves deserve and should be compensated for forced and unpaid labor. But also, since slavery, there have been hundreds of years of additional harm to Black communities that contribute to the conditions that we're in today. Um, and then also, we can go to the next slide. In the process of the task force community engagement, Black people throughout the state were surveyed or engaged in listening sessions about their perspectives on eligibility. And the majority of people really support a more expansive view of reparations that's in alignment with this UN framework. In addition to compensation, people said that they wanted community investments. They said that they wanted educational opportunities, greater access to healthcare, particularly, like I said, mental health care. They wanted initiatives to support Black businesses, greater access to home ownership, restoration for people that are impacted by the justice system. And all of this is very rooted in and connected to this original sin of slavery, which transformed into systemic racism and oppression. Folks want community investments because our communities have not been invested in for multiple generations. Black folks have some of the lowest high school graduation rates and disparate access to universities. And a lot of that is rooted in what was previously segregation. And so we think about, how can we repair all of those pieces of harm? And ultimately, the task force opted for a harm-based approach as well, which really recommended direct cash payments to descendants of people who were enslaved, in addition to over 300 programmatic and policy changes that are meant to address ongoing harm and provide repair for things that stem from Jim Crow, Black codes, redlining, segregation, and other systemic harms. And so in the slide, I kind of have listed like all of the chapters of what they were focusing their policy recommendations on. So there was enslavement, racial terror, political disenfranchisement. And so there are a number of also democracy reforms that they put in there around like how can we ensure that more Black folks have access to voting, housing segregation and property takings, pathologizing the African American families in relation to like social care and social work and discrimination that families face in those processes and in terms of, families. Um, and yeah, all of these other kind of issue areas where we know that the current conditions of Black communities are really disparate and need to be addressed. And so our organization is also more aligned with this broader, expansive approach. We feel like, research, kind of data, the experience of the people serving our communities really show that compensation alone is not going to close the wealth gap or address ongoing harm to Black communities. So we're owed compensation, but we're also owed holistic repair that enables us to actually thrive in this state and in the country broadly. Like we still need to address, like I mentioned, slavery in the ongoing form. We also need to build supportive infrastructure like Black-owned banks so that the wealth that's acquired through direct cash payments is not profiting and being held by banks that have historical ties to slavery. One thing that the task force report mentions is Chase came out with a report that detailed their connections to slavery, and some of their predecessors had actually owned slaves, like 2,000 and something slaves, and then eventually, because they were insuring them for some sort of loan, and that is an example of just like, what it would mean to put a bunch of funds into Chase, to profit off of these things and be able to invest it while we're trying to repair this harm. We also need funds to purchase homes, but we face discrimination in appraisals. So if we just get wealth, how does that affect the fact that folks are still discriminated against when they want to buy homes in certain neighborhoods, when they're trying to sell their homes? Black folks have the lowest life expectancy among all racial and ethnic groups. And there are recommendations in there that touch on systemic pollution of Black communities that has led to, significant asthma rates and chronic illnesses. There are recommendations that touch on Black maternal health, which we know we've been facing a significant maternal mortality crisis and low infant birth rate. And so there are just a number of things that we really need to repair within the Black community that stem from slavery, that go beyond just this compensation piece. And so that's kind of where we align, and just wanted to kind of flag that as a thing because I know that's also in the landscape. And so there are just these ongoing conditions that we really want to impact. And I will drop in the chat for folks if y'all are interested in reviewing the task force report. This links to the executive summary, which shows you like a short list of all of the policy recommendations, but you can also see on the Office of the Attorney General website the full report, which is very long, but definitely worth getting into if you have the time. And so what are we doing now? What progress has been made? Since the conclusion of the task force, the California Legislative Black Caucus has introduced over 25 legislative or budget proposals based on their recommendations. And I'll also drop another document in the chat, which is just our kind of recap of what happened last year and some of the progress. I don't have all 25 bills on here. I was just kind of touch on some of the highlights. I think one, California gave a formal apology, which is really important because if you apologize, then I think that we should expect change behavior. And so we expect that the governor and the legislature will show up for, taking action and trying to implement these recommendations because we are sorry for the state's role in these things. Um, and so there was this formal apology on behalf of California. Last year, we also passed a bill to develop a reparations bureau in the Civil Rights Department of the state, which would handle future compensation claims and also implementation of reparations related programming. And then we also expanded the Crown Act. So a while ago, when Senator Holly Mitchell was still in the legislature. She introduced the Crown Act, which I know a lot of folks were in support of. And there was like an expansion of that in 2024 to really just continue to prevent discrimination for hair in the workplace. But then it was also expanded to, sports like college sports and things like that, where we know we'd seen videos of folks cutting off people's locks or, discriminating against like Afro-textured hair in different spaces. And so, that was also definitely an important like programmatic piece that has had some impact. And then in the budget last year, they also dedicated 6 million to public education so that we could really do a better public education reparations campaign. And this is modeled after the Japanese reparations public education campaign, which was inside of the California State Library and provided like grants to museums, to organizations to really build monuments, to spread information and do that really public education piece of it because we didn't really get to do a lot of that during the task force process. Unfortunately, it was also during the pandemic. So at the same time that they were doing this process, we were trying to, figure out what are the new ways that we can get at people. That was a year of a lot of learning on all sides. And so now trying to really do more of that public education work. But beyond those bills, there's also been various bills to support like data collection so that we can create some better policies. This year, the Quality Commission is supposed to be reviewing content from the task force report that can be added to the K through 12 curriculum. And yeah, so those are some of the other pieces that have been passed. But I will say that we have not been able to get really strong programmatic bills passed. Even when we've gotten them out of the legislature, they have been vetoed for budget reasons. So, we tried to end slavery in California, that made it off the legislature onto the ballot and then failed, not by too much percentage points, but it was really difficult to get past the narrative and to get folks to see the connection between slavery and current prison labor. There's kind of the dehumanization of folks who are incarcerated of like, they should have to work and maybe, but also should they be compensated for the work while they're in there? And should we also change our constitution to reflect that, we don't support slavery? And then we also tried to pass like a bill to get funding for home ownership. So to like dedicate some of the funding that's in the current home ownership program specifically to Black folks, like 10% of it. But that was also vetoed by the governor due to budget. We tried to get some like medically supportive food nutrition interventions for Medi-Cal recipients, racial equity analysis, preference in licensing to respond to discrimination that folks can face in state licensing processes. And all of those things, would have costed some money to implement. And I think for the last few years, everything's been rejected. That's over like 150,000. So we definitely had some trouble on the budget side of it. And that's been a major barrier for reparations. And then also some things were rejected because before we passed the Reparations Bureau last year, we didn't really have the infrastructure to hold some of this programming. And that was also mentioned in some of the veto messages by the governor. And so now we are focused on and are supporting the implementation of the Reparations Bureau. They're trying to find a director who will be leading that. We hopefully would like to get someone in before this governor is out. And get that started to be like developed. And then the other pieces that are barriers are just like this federal landscape and the attacks on DEI, the attacks on affirmative action, on equal protections. It's just been difficult because we are simultaneously trying to protect things, the rights that we have gotten and the progress that we have made, while also, trying to make new progress. And so that has also just been difficult in this landscape, but it's also a part of why we need a multiracial coalition of support. Like we need folks that are in these other districts because, the Black Caucus is 12 people. And so they can introduce things every year, but they cannot get legislation passed on their own. And, Black folks, due to gentrification, displacement, don't have as much voting power throughout the state in every region. Like we have a lot, in SoCal and LA area, maybe some in the Bay Area, but also, need for other constituencies to show legislators that this really matters, is important to folks. Next slide. And so this year, really thinking about this revenue issue and this barrier to revenue, we are working with Assemblymember Bryan's office on a bill called the Truth and Disclosure Act, which would require corporations that are contracting in and operating in the state to disclose any historical ties to slavery. So similar to that Chase example that I gave, but we also specifically in that bill name like rice companies, sugar companies, insurance and financial institutions. If you're an insurance company, did any of your predecessors insure plantations, insure folks for, property which was slaves at the time? And this is really aligned with the UN principle of satisfaction through acknowledgement and public disclosure of harms that are caused by corporations, and also gets us to a different part of the conversation. So the task force process was focused on like, what did the state do? What were the harms and how can we repair those? But we have not had a conversation about the beneficiaries of slavery. So not only who did the harm and what was the harm, but like who benefited from the harm and what is the amount, what is the value and the wealth that was attained by corporations that have these connections to slavery? And, they should pay for reparations. They should be a part of this repair. It should not be, on taxpayers or on folks like that. I know a lot of the time people will be like, I shouldn't have to pay for reparations because I'm not connected to this. I didn't own slaves. And to a certain extent, that is very true. Corporations that benefited from these, the folks that built significant wealth from this should definitely be contributing to what it costs to repair and run these programs. And so this would ultimately provide like a public database that has like the number of the corporations in the state that have connections to slavery, how much they're worth, how much the contracts that they have are with the state, and hopefully would enable us in the future to know who should be paying for reparations and how to potentially develop like some sort of reparations fund. And so next slide. In terms of supporting reparations fight, we definitely would love support from the League of Women Voters on this bill, AB 2599. But we also just generally are looking for allyship in terms of like building a multiracial coalition of support. We're going to be doing legislative advocacy, so there will be, letters and legislative engagement that folks could be a part of if they're interested, particularly in district, with a lot of folks. And then the other piece is public education. So the state is doing this process of public education, but we also, as ART, run a speakers bureau where we like have a training for folks on like how do you run a reparations presentation for your organization with your membership, like talk about reparations so that more than Black folks are talking about reparations. And so we've seen a really good example of that with like Nikkei Progressives, which is a Japanese organization. They were also previously involved in the Japanese reparations movement, and they've done presentations with like their membership and other Japanese community members to talk about why is it important that we also support Black reparations? How does this relate to, what we were also able to get during our own process? And so also just need, more supporters and more public speakers to be talking about reparations. And so if there are community events that y'all have or other things like that, it would be great to, have you all potentially join one of our speaker bureau sessions to be able to incorporate that into some of your work. And then I just have the regular stuff of just follow us, social media. We have a website as well that we're revamping right now. It kind of looks like a blog, but it's about to look really cool. Our comms team did a whole revamp. So it's about to look really cool, and I also put that there. And that's it in terms of what I had to present.